The stench first invaded the most distant corridors of Versailles, a sweet, putrid smell that spread like an invisible plague through the gilded halls, infiltrating the embroidered silks and crystal mirrors. The courtiers began to whisper, covering their noses with perfumed handkerchiefs scented with amber and bergamot, while pretending not to notice that something terrible was happening at the heart of Europe's most magnificent palace. It was August 1715, and the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, was dying in the most grotesque way a mortal could imagine, his own body becoming the sepulchre of his glory. 20 years earlier, in that same Versailles, the king strolled through the gardens with the hauteur of a god among mortals. His footsteps echoed with absolute authority on the polished marble, each movement calculated to demonstrate that here was the man who had transformed France into the center of the civilized world. At 67, Louis XIV still radiated the magnetism that had seduced entire courts, conquered territories, and bent the wills of popes and emperors. His powdered wig framed a face that, although marked by time, retained the aristocratic expression of one who had never known defeat. His dark eyes shone with the iron-willed intelligence that had built an empire on which the sun literally never set. It was the height of a reign that had already lasted more than half a century. A golden era in which the king's word was not only law, but practically a divine revelation. The Palace of Versailles mirrored that grandeur like a perfect reflection of the royal soul. Every hall had been conceived to celebrate his magnificence. The Hall of Mirrors captured and multiplied his image into infinity. The gardens stretched to the horizon, like nature tamed by his will, and the royal apartments rivaled in luxury the descriptions of paradise itself. Thousands of courtiers orbited around him like planets around the sun, each vying for a glance, a word, a gesture that might elevate them in the complex hierarchy of the court. The royal protocol had been elevated to the status of sacred art. Every movement of the king, from waking to sleeping, was a religious ceremony in which nobles competed for the privilege of fastening his shirt or witnessing his meals. It was a perfectly oiled machine of power, where every cog worked in harmony to maintain the illusion that a man could be simultaneously mortal and divine. But by 1710, almost imperceptible signs began to crack the facade of royal perfection. The king, always meticulous about his appearance, started spending more time in front of the mirrors, adjusting his wig with slightly trembling gestures he attributed to the weight of the realm's responsibilities. His walks through the gardens became shorter, interrupted by pauses he justified as moments of philosophical contemplation. The court doctors, led by the famous Guy Crescent Fagan, were summoned more frequently for consultations, always described as precautions of royal prudence and never as signs of real concern. Louis himself, schooled from childhood to never show weakness, turned every symptom into a new opportunity to demonstrate his supernatural willpower. The winter of 1711 brought the first visible manifestations of the approaching decay. A persistent pain in his left leg, initially attributed to the rigors of the hunt, began to interfere with the sacred routine of public appearances. The king discreetly leaned on ornate canes, each becoming another symbol of his royal elegance. The courtiers, trained to interpret every nuance of the king's body language, began whispering theories of aristocratic gout or fatigue of great minds. Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife and closest confidant, was perhaps the first to perceive that something more sinister was at hand. In letters to her sister, she described a certain melancholy that sometimes invades His Majesty's countenance, as if a shadow passed over the son of the kingdom. During 1712 and 1713, the transformation accelerated almost imperceptibly to untrained eyes. The king developed a growing obsession with purification rituals and preventive bloodletting, subjecting himself to increasingly elaborate treatments prescribed by his doctors as a strengthening of the royal constitution. His meals, always public, spectacles, where each course was served with ceremonies worthy of a solemn mass, became longer and more laborious. The king chewed slowly, pausing between courses with a distant expression his courtiers interpreted as philosophical depth. In reality, a dull ache had begun radiating through his left leg, gradually rising like a poisonous tide that respected no anatomical boundaries. The year 1714 marked the beginning of true agony, though few dared to acknowledge the signs. The king's left leg had developed a small, almost insignificant wound that the doctors treated with poultices of aromatic herbs and blessed ointments. XIV, chief physician of a reputation built over decades of service to the court, declared with scientific authority that it was a disturbance of the royal humors, natural in superior spirits subjected to the tensions of universal governance. The wound, however, had characteristics that defied all medical knowledge of the time. Its edges bore a peculiar grayish tint, and from it emanated an odor that matched none of the classic descriptions in medical treatises. It was a sweet, penetrating smell, reminiscent simultaneously of decaying flowers and oxidized metal. As the months passed, the wound began to expand with a calculated slowness that seemed deliberately cruel. Each morning, when the royal chamberlain helped the king dress, they noted that the dark stain had grown a few millimeters, like a shadow gradually devouring royal flesh. Louis XIV, however, maintained his routine with a determination bordering on the supernatural. He continued receiving foreign ambassadors, presiding over ministerial councils, and participating in religious ceremonies with the same imperial majesty as always. His willpower had become an invisible armor that protected not only his dignity, but the very structure of the kingdom, which depended on his physical presence as a guarantee of continuity. The first truly alarming signs appeared in early 1715. The wound, which until then had remained relatively localized, began discharging a fluid that stained the royal silk stockings in yellowish and brownish hues. The king changed his stockings several times a day, always in private, refusing any assistance that might expose the true extent of his condition. Madame de Maintenon became his accomplice in this conspiracy of silence, personally ordering the destruction of every stained garment and supervising the preparation of ever more elaborate ointments. In her intimate letters, she began to describe a profound sadness that invades the king, as if he sensed distant storms that had not yet reached the horizon. The spring of 1715 brought a dramatic acceleration of the deterioration process. The wound had transformed into an open ulcer that refused to heal, regardless of the treatments applied. XIV summoned an extraordinary medical council, gathering the most renowned specialists from Paris, Lyon, and even some famous Italian doctors known for their anatomical expertise. They examined the king's leg in secret sessions, held in the private apartments, away from the curious eyes of the court. Their conclusions were simultaneously technical and evasive. They spoke of humor corruption, imbalance of vital elements, and adverse astral influences, but none dared utter the words that haunted their private thoughts. By June, the reality became impossible to hide completely. The king began to limp visibly, leaning more heavily on ornate canes, discreetly placed at strategic points in every hall he frequented. His once robust and imposing physique began to wither almost imperceptibly. The royal garments, sewn by tailors, who had known every inch of his body for decades, had to be discreetly altered to accommodate the weight loss he publicly attributed to a spiritual diet of purification. The most observant courtiers noticed that the king had developed the habit of pausing important conversations in silent intervals, during which his face assumed an expression of intense concentration, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. July brought the first fever episodes that could no longer be attributed to minor indispositions. The king woke during the night drenched in sweat, forcing the chamberlains to change not only his nightshirt, but also the silk sheets that became imbued with a strange, persistent odor. It was a smell that did not correspond to the king's natural, admired personal scent. This new odor had characteristics that defied description, sweet but nauseating, familiar but deeply unsettling. The chamberlains, discreetly instructed by Madame de Maintenon, burned incense and aromatic herbs in the royal quarters, creating a perfumed atmosphere that masked but could not completely eliminate the stench of the disease that had settled. At the heart of Versailles, it was during one of these feverish nights that the king had his first clear vision of the true extent of his condition. Waking before dawn, he discreetly dismissed the chamberlains and examined his leg by candlelight. What he saw must have been a vision that defied his entire royal education about dignity and control. The ulcer had expanded to cover a considerable area of his calf, its edges displaying a coloration ranging from grayish-green to deep black. More disturbing still was the fact that the skin around the wound had developed a strange texture, as if gradually being transformed into something no longer quite human flesh. The king stared at this sight for long minutes, perhaps realizing for the first time that he was facing something that transcended the normal categories of illness and cure. August 1715 marked the beginning of the final phase of this agony that had stretched for months. Gangrene, the word no court doctor dared pronounce aloud, had begun creeping up the king's leg with the inexorability of a poisonous tide. The process was simultaneously slow and relentless. Each day brought new territories of dead flesh, new areas where the skin took on the grayish tint of life and death. The odor, which until then had been partially masked by perfumes and incense, became a constant, inescapable presence in the royal apartments. It was a smell that transcended the normal categories of decay, possessing characteristics seemingly designed to cause nausea and horror in anyone who perceived it. The doctors, confronted with a reality that defied all their theoretical knowledge, began proposing increasingly desperate and brutal treatments. Daily bloodletting was performed at multiple points on the royal body in an attempt to purify the corrupted blood and slow the infection's advance. The king endured these procedures with stoic patience that impressed even his torturing physicians. Guy Crescent Fagan suggested amputating the leg, but this possibility was rejected not only by the king, but by all advisors who understood the political implications of a monarch visibly mutilated. The idea that the Sun King might appear before his subjects and foreign ambassadors with an amputated leg was deemed more dangerous to the stability of the realm than the king's very death. During the first days of August, the king's condition reached a level of horror that transcended the worst imaginations of human suffering. Gangrene had climbed to his thigh, transforming the entire left leg into a mass of dead flesh that needed constant cleaning and bandaging. The wound cleaning process became a daily ritual of mutual torture. The king endured indescribable pain during the procedures, while the physicians and chamberlains had to withstand not only the nauseating smell, but also the sight of a body literally rotting while still alive. The bandages, changed several times a day, came away soaked in yellow-green pus mixed with congealed blood and fragments of necrotic tissue. The most disturbing aspect of the situation was that, while his body decomposed gradually, the king's mind remained perfectly lucid. He continued receiving ministerial reports, making administrative decisions, and corresponding with other European monarchs. His capacity for mental concentration contrasted terrifyingly with his visible physical deterioration. During public audiences, which he insisted on holding despite discreet protests from his advisors, the king sat on his throne with his legs strategically positioned to hide the true extent of his condition. Only the slight tremor in his hands and a growing pallor on his face betrayed the supernatural battle he waged to maintain appearances of normalcy. Madame de Maintenon became the only complete witness to the royal agony. She spent hours at the royal bedside during the nights when the pains intensified to the point of making sleep impossible. The king, educated from childhood to never show weakness before subordinates, allowed himself to express his suffering only in the presence of his secret wife. She later described these moments as visions of purgatory, where a noble spirit was subjected to trials that defied the limits of human endurance. The king alternated between moments of Christian resignation, accepting his suffering as atonement for the sins of the kingdom, and outbursts of impotent rage against a fate that subjected him to a death so unworthy of his greatness. From mid-August, new symptoms began to manifest, indicating that the infection had entered the royal bloodstream. High fevers alternated with violent chills that made the king shake uncontrollably under multiple layers of silk blankets. His skin, once known for aristocratic whiteness, took on a yellowish hue that the doctors attributed to disturbances of the royal liver caused by an excess of melancholic humors. In reality, the Sun King's body was being gradually poisoned by the toxic byproducts of his own flesh's decomposition. Each vital organ began to be affected by the cascade of toxins circulating in his royal blood like a venom distilled in the laboratories of hell. The last days of August brought a dramatic acceleration of the deterioration process. Gangrene had reached the royal groin, threatening to spread to the abdomen and make inevitable a rapid but even more agonizing death. The odor emanating from the royal body had become so intense that the apartments needed to be constantly aired. Out yet even then, the atmosphere remained laden with a stench that caused instant nausea in anyone entering. The chamberlains developed elaborate techniques to breathe through their mouths and apply aromatic ointments to their nostrils before approaching the royal bed. Even so, many of them had to be replaced regularly because they developed uncontrollable vomiting that prevented them from performing their duties. The king, aware that his death was approaching rapidly, began making spiritual and political preparations for the dynastic transition. He summoned the Dauphin, his great-grandson of only 5 years, for a private audience that would become legendary in French monarchical history. The boy, frightened by his great-grandfather's cadaverous appearance and the nauseating odor that pervaded the royal apartments, began to cry when brought near the bed. The king, summoning strength that seemed to come from beyond the grave, managed to utter words that would become his political testament, instructions on how to rule justly, avoid unnecessary wars, and always remember that even kings are mortal. Before God, his voice, once capable of filling entire halls with magnetic authority, had dwindled to a hoarse whisper that forced everyone to lean in to hear his final words. During the first days of September, the royal agony reached proportions that defied any adequate description. The king alternated between periods of feverish unconsciousness and moments of crystal-clear lucidity, where the pain became absolutely unbearable. Madame de Maintenon described these episodes as visions of a superior spirit being gradually separated from a body that had become its prison. The pains were so intense that the king, despite all his royal education, began to groan involuntarily during their worst moments. These sounds, low, continuous moans escaping his throat without any conscious control, echoed through the corridors of Versailles like a macabre symphony announcing the end of an era. The doctors, completely defeated by the relentless progression of gangrene, resorted to treatments that were more rituals of despair than genuine attempts at cure. They applied poultices made of exotic herbs imported from the colonies, performed bloodlettings at increasingly esoteric points on the royal body, and even attempted cauterization with a red-hot iron in a desperate effort to stop the infections. Advance. Each of these procedures caused additional pain that added to the already unimaginable suffering. But the king submitted to everything with a resignation that his contemporaries interpreted as sanctity, and that perhaps was simply the last refuge of a mind that refused to accept its own impotence in the face of physical decomposition. By September 10th, the gangrene had reached the king's abdomen, marking the beginning of the terminal phase of agony. The decomposition process accelerated dramatically. Entire areas of the royal body took on the black hue characteristic of cellular death, while other regions developed a waxy pallor that contrasted horribly with the gangrenous patches. The king struggled even to swallow liquids, forcing his doctors to administer nutrition via enemas, a procedure he considered deeply humiliating to his royal dignity. His breathing became labored and irregular, producing guttural sounds that resembled more the final gasps of a wounded animal than the last sighs of a monarch. The most disturbing aspect of this final phase was that despite advanced physical decomposition, the king remained at times absolutely lucid, fully aware of his condition. During these moments, he made observations about his own death with a horrifying clarity, describing the sensations of his decomposing body with the precision of an anatomist examining his own corpse. "I can feel death rising through my body like cold water," he told Madame de Maintenon during one of those night vigils. "It takes possession of every part of me, but my mind remains to observe every detail of this conquest." These statements were whispered with a voice barely audible, yet each word was articulated so perfectly that its impact was all the more profound. The last days before the final death were marked by deterioration that transcended all normal categories of human suffering. The Sun King's body had truly become a living corpse, with large areas of dead flesh coexisting alongside vital organs that refused to stop functioning. The odor had grown so intense that it reached the farthest halls of Versailles, forcing courtiers to press perfumed handkerchiefs against their noses constantly. Some foreign visitors, unprepared for this reality, fainted upon entering the corridors near the royal apartments. The very architecture of the palace seemed imbued with the presence of death, as if the stones and marble had absorbed something of the corruption emanating from the royal body in decomposition. In the early hours of September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV of France finally succumbed to the gangrene that had devoured his body during months of indescribable agony. His death was simultaneously a relief and a tragedy. A relief because it ended suffering that had transcended the limits of endurance, and a tragedy because it marked the end of an era of grandeur that would never be recovered. Those who first entered the royal apartments after his death declared that the odor had intensified even further, as if death itself had released toxic vapors that had been contained by the king's willpower. The body, which had been the temple of divine majesty, had become a ruin that defied any attempt at preservation or preparation for a public funeral. The embalming of the royal body became a military operation requiring exceptional techniques and precautions. The experts summoned for the procedure had to wear improvised masks and work in short shifts to avoid intoxication by the vapors emanating from the royal corpse. Even after death, the decomposition process continued with frightening speed, forcing the embalmers to accelerate their procedures and use extraordinary quantities of spices and preserving substances. The final result was a body that bore only a distant resemblance to the king who had dominated Europe for more than half a century. The royal face, once capable of intimidating ambassadors and seducing courtiers, now bore an expression of petrified suffering that no embalming artistry could fully disguise. Louis XIV's funeral was organized with unusual haste, reflecting not only the political urgency of the dynastic transition, but also the practical difficulties of preserving a body in such an advanced state of decomposition. The ceremony, though, retaining all the traditional pomp of royal funerals, was marked by an atmosphere of haste and discomfort that contrasted with the usual majesty of such events. Many participants later commented on a lingering odor that remained perceptible even through the exceptional amounts of incense and perfumes burned throughout the ceremony. It was as if the Sun King's own death had created an olfactory mark that no amount of purification rituals could fully erase. Contemporary descriptions of Louis XIV's death were carefully censored and edited by the court's official chroniclers, who transformed a grotesque agony into a pious, edifying death. Official accounts spoke of a king who accepted his fate with Christian resignation, offering his sufferings as atonement for the sins of the kingdom and departing for eternity at peace with God and his conscience. This sanitized version was repeated by generations of historians who had access only to official sources. However, private letters, personal diaries, and unofficial reports preserved fragments of the truth about a death that was simultaneously the biological end of a man and the symbolic collapse of a divine conception of monarchy that could not survive the sight of its earthly representative literally rotting while still alive. The horrible death of Louis XIV became, paradoxically, his final and most powerful demonstration of humanity. During decades of reign, he had carefully cultivated the image of a being positioned between human and divine, capable of controlling not only political destinies, but also the very laws of nature through his sovereign will. The gangrene that devoured his body for months represented the ultimate revenge of mortality against the pretensions of royal transcendence. Each day of agony was a brutal lesson on the limits of human power, even when exercised in its most absolute form. The Sun King, who had spent his entire life being worshipped as a terrestrial embodiment of divine majesty, discovered in his final months that his body was subject to the same laws of decomposition that governed the corpses of his humblest subjects. The psychological impact of the royal death on the court of Versailles was profound and lasting. Courtiers who had spent decades orbiting the royal majesty like planets around the sun suddenly found their center of gravity gone, leaving them adrift in a universe that seemed to have lost its fundamental laws. Many of them never fully recovered from the shock of witnessing the gradual decomposition of one whom they considered a force of nature. Madame de Maintenon, who had been the closest witness to the royal agony, withdrew to a convent where she spent the last years of her life in near total seclusion, as if she had witnessed something beyond human comprehension and psychological integration. The transformation of the Palace of Versailles after the king's death symbolically reflected the end of an era. The halls that had echoed with laughter and elegant conversation for decades became spaces haunted by memories of grandeur that seemed to belong to a mythological past. The very smell of the royal death, which had permeated the apartments during the final months of his life, remained perceptible for years despite all attempts at purification. Some sensitive visitors claimed to sense a disturbing presence in the corridors where the king had spent his last days, as if something of his agony had crystallized within the palace's architecture. It was a haunting that did not involve supernatural apparitions, but rather the persistent memory of suffering that had transcended the normal bounds of human experience. Louis XIV's death also marked the end of a specific conception of monarchy that had dominated Europe for centuries. The idea that kings could be simultaneously mortal and divine, subject to human frailties, yet invested with supernatural authority, did not survive the vision of a monarch literally rotting while still trying to rule. The subsequent generations of French kings never fully recovered the aura of sacredness that had surrounded their predecessors. The image of the Sun King dying of gangrene became a powerful metaphor for the intrinsic limits of any power, based on the pretension of transcending the human condition. It was a lesson that would echo through the following centuries, preparing the intellectual ground for revolutions that would question not only the competence of kings, but their very divine legitimacy. The medical legacy of Louis XIV's death was equally significant, though less well known. The detailed description of the royal gangrene symptoms preserved in the private diaries of the court physicians became one of the first accurate scientific documentations of this condition. Guy Crescent-Fagan and his colleagues, though unable to cure their royal patient, produced clinical observations that were studied by subsequent generations of doctors. Their accounts of gangrene progression, associated symptoms, and the ineffectiveness of the treatments available at the time contributed to the later development of knowledge that eventually made it possible to treat similar conditions. It was a historical irony that the Sun King's horrible death indirectly contributed to saving the lives of ordinary people who would suffer similar afflictions in the future. The psychological dimension of the royal agony also deserves deep reflection. Louis XIV spent the last months of his life in a situation that challenged all his fundamental beliefs about power, control, and dignity. A man educated from childhood to believe that his will could shape reality found himself completely impotent before a biological process that ignored his royal authority. This experience of absolute impotence must have been psychologically devastating in ways that transcended the physical suffering itself. It was as if the universe had demonstrated, in the cruelest possible manner, that even the most absolute power remained subject to the unyielding laws of biology and death. During the long nights of agony, when pain made any attempt at sleep impossible, the king must have confronted existential questions for which his royal education had never prepared him. How could a man who had spent decades believing himself to be the earthly representative of divine will reconcile that belief with the reality of a body decomposing independently of any royal command? How could someone who had ordered the deaths of thousands of soldiers in wars of conquest understand his own mortality when it manifested so grotesquely and prolongedly? These unanswered questions must have echoed in his mind during the lucid moments that punctuated his agony, creating a spiritual suffering perhaps even more unbearable than the physical pain. Madame de Maintenon's reports suggest that the king went through periods of deep religious crisis during his last months. A man educated to believe that God had personally chosen him to rule France found himself in a position that seemed to be a punishment from a cruel and relentless deity. His confessors, confronted with a penitent who had exercised absolute power for decades, had to find theological explanations for suffering that seemed to transcend any proportionality between sin and punishment. The interpretations offered ranged from the idea that the king was being purified for a special salvation to theories of collective expiation for the sins of the entire kingdom. None of these explanations seemed completely satisfactory in the face of suffering that defied any traditional theological framework. The court of Versailles, during those final months, became a macabre theater where the normal appearances of aristocratic life coexisted with the inescapable reality of impending death. Courtiers continued participating in ceremonies, intrigues, and celebrations as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew they were playing roles in a play that was nearing its end. The contrast between the superficial normality of court life and the horror unfolding in the royal apartments created an atmosphere of unreality that profoundly affected everyone involved. It was like living in a dream where familiar gestures gradually lost their meaning, where protocols established over decades continued to be followed mechanically, while their reason for existing literally rotted away at the heart of the palace. Foreign ambassadors who visited Versailles during this period left accounts revealing how the royal agony affected international diplomatic relations. Representatives from other European courts found themselves in a delicate situation. They needed to maintain appearances of diplomatic normality while knowing they were negotiating with a realm whose center of power was literally decomposing. Some of these diplomats described feeling as if they were conversing with ghosts, where words were spoken and agreements discussed, yet everyone knew it would all be invalidated by the king's imminent death. It was a haunted form of diplomacy, where the present still functioned, but the future had become completely uncertain. The question of royal succession during those final months became a source of anxiety that transcended normal political concerns. The heir to the throne was a 5-year-old child, completely incapable of assuming the responsibilities of government that his great-grandfather had exercised with absolute authority. The idea that royal power would pass from a man who had dominated Europe for decades to a child who barely knew how to read created a historical vertigo that affected not only France, but the entire European balance. It was as if the very continuity of civilization depended on a transition that seemed impossible to carry out without catastrophic consequences. The last documents signed by Louis XIV reveal how his physical deterioration affected even his most basic administrative capacities. His handwriting, once characterized by an elegance reflecting his aristocratic education, became progressively more trembling and irregular. The final royal signatures are almost illegible, revealing the supernatural effort the king had to make just to maintain even the most elementary functions of his office. Some historians interpreted those trembling signatures as visual metaphors for the kingdom itself, a structure that still functioned but had lost the firmness and confidence that had characterized it during decades of greatness. The most disturbing aspect of the situation was that the king's physical decomposition seemed accompanied by a parallel dissolution of the entire social structure built around him. Courtiers, accustomed to orbiting his magnetic presence, gradually found themselves losing their reference points. The hierarchies that had governed court life for decades began to seem arbitrary and meaningless when their ultimate foundation, the person of the king, proved subject to the same laws of decomposition that governed any mortal body. It was a social dissolution that began almost imperceptibly, but would accelerate dramatically after the king's death. Contemporary medicine, confronted with a condition that defied all available knowledge, resorted to treatments that were simultaneously desperate and grotesque. In addition to constant bloodletting and cauterization attempts, the doctors applied substances including mercury, arsenic, and even human excrement. Remedies considered effective at the time, but likely accelerating the poisoning of the royal organism. Each new treatment was announced with great hope and abandoned quickly when it proved not only ineffective, but often counterproductive. It was a cycle of hope and disillusionment repeated weekly, creating an atmosphere of growing despair. Among all involved in the king's care, the religious dimension of the royal agony also deserves detailed analysis. The king, educated in a religiosity that emphasized his chosen divine status, found himself in a situation where he seemed to be punished by God in an exemplary manner. His confessors, facing a penitent who had wielded absolute power for decades, had to find theological explanations for suffering that seemed to transcend any normal proportion between sin and punishment. Interpretations ranged from the notion that the king was being purified for special salvation to theories of collective expiation for the kingdom's sins. None of these explanations seemed entirely satisfactory before the reality of suffering that defied any traditional theological framework. Court artists, traditionally charged with immortalizing royal grandeur through paintings and sculptures, found themselves in an impossible situation during those final months. How could they artistically represent a king literally rotting away? How could they reconcile the tradition of majestic portraits with the reality of a man disfigured by disease? The solution was simply to halt any attempts at contemporary artistic representation, creating an iconographic void that contrasted dramatically with the abundance of images that had characterized the entire previous reign. It was as if art itself had become incapable of processing a reality transcending its traditional aesthetic categories. Louis XIV's death represented not only the end of a reign, but of an entire era in European history. The model of absolute monarchy he had embodied for more than half a century was revealed as mortal in both a literal and symbolic sense. His prolonged agony became a powerful metaphor for the intrinsic limits of any power based on the pretension of transcending the human condition. It was a lesson that would echo through the following centuries, influencing not only the evolution of political institutions, but also philosophical conceptions of power, authority, and mortality that would pave the intellectual groundwork for revolutions transforming Europe in subsequent centuries. The perfume of death that spread through Versailles during those final months became, paradoxically, the Sun King's last and most enduring legacy. It was a smell that transcended its physical properties to become an olfactory symbol of the mortality haunting any pretension of human greatness. Even after the king's physical death, even after the purification of the apartments and renewal of the palace's air, that smell remained in collective memory as a persistent reminder that all earthly glory is destined for decomposition. It was the olfactory signature of a lesson in humility that no amount of power or prestige could indefinitely avoid. Thus died Louis XIV, the Sun King, not in the glory of battle nor in the serenity of a tranquil old age, but in the prolonged agony of a body decomposing, while his mind remained lucid enough to observe every grotesque detail. His death was simultaneously the biological end of an individual and the symbolic collapse of a conception of power that had dominated Europe for centuries. The sweet, nauseating stench that emanated from his apartments during those final months became the perfect metaphor for a grandeur revealing its own rottenness, for a majesty discovering its own limits in the cruelest and most definitive way possible. It was the end of an era, announced not by fanfares or cannons, but by the unmistakable perfume of human mortality triumphing over all pretensions of earthly transcendence.